everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today we'll be taking a look at actually art theory book, so something a little bit different for the channel. But this is a book I would highly recommend for pretty much anyone who would be in our audience, which are cartoonists and illustrators. This is a book that's very much trying to make an argument for the merit of cartooning and illustration without trying to make an argument that it's like legitimate fine art. It's actually almost keeping itself separate on purpose as being better for not being engaged in the fine arts. The book is called Stick Figures, Drawing as a Human Practice by David B. Dowd. I bought this because in the age of AI making art, I've been thinking a lot about, thanks to all the conversations we've had on the channel, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of the benefit to the person who's learning the skills of drawing. Also, as an educator, like, I have to adjust my teaching as the AI changes the job landscape. So it's the critical thinking aspect of drawing, the observational aspect that interests me more. And I was really hoping that this book would be kind of a manifesto on that and give some teaching ideas and ways to foster that way of thinking. It didn't really have that. So in that sense, it's a bit of a disappointment. But it is a really theoretically rich book, and it introduces a lot of vocabulary that kind of sums up the way I have been thinking about things and gives me a language to talk about the things I want to talk about that I didn't have before. And that is always a valuable book. I don't feel like I really learned a lot reading this. I feel like most people would learn a lot reading this. As someone who sits around and thinks about cartooning and illustration and comics and art, these obviously are just things that I've spent more time thinking about. But it is a book that puts those all in such clear, precise arguments, gives it historical backing, and then creates a vocabulary to use. This is a very, very valuable book. So here we have kind of like a thesis right out the beginning. The sense of confusion has stunted our understanding of drawing and kept it from being seen as a tool for learning above all else. Students have developed needless performance anxiety about largely anachronistic rendering skills and have gained little experience with drawing as a thinking and planning tool, which is something I'm always stressing for my students, which is how most people use it, and have been exposed to exhausted cultural hierarchies, by now grounded in little more than habit. As both a subject and a practice, drawing must be liberated from the aesthetic cage to which it has been confined. And I think that is a kind of wonderful statement of intent there. I'm just going to go through and read some of the thoughts that I think are interesting in this book. Today we live in a bewildering landscape of manufactured novelty, the digital present, a 24-hour barrage. Every day we grow more alienated from the world. Ubiquitous screens feed us passive diversions and seductive illusions, blinkering our perspective, interrupting if not precluding genuine repose. Like an old friend, drawing calls us away from these distractions, back to an ancient watchfulness amid our physical and social surroundings. By demanding our attention, drawing anchors us to experience. It grounds knowledge in the manual, not the digital. It offers a form of sense-making, a method for coming to grips. And that's such a powerful statement of what drawing can be when it's not all about the result. I would keep that marked, and actually I'm going to keep that marked. And that comes in handy in case anyone's ever trying to ask me to justify why we should still have fine arts in education. I think that sentence sums it up, or that paragraph sums it up pretty well. Then the thing that I like the most about this book is the kind of couple poles that he creates, these spectrums that he creates. So he comes up with some new vocabulary or uses things in a different way. So first he puts out the glyphic mode of thinking and drawing, and this is probably more obvious. It's also think of as the graphic, the iconic. It's what we do when we're cartooning. It says, my suggestion of using glyph collapses distinctions valued by specialists, consider it a critical rather than technical usage. Writing from a modern perspective, I'm particularly focused on the adjectival glyphic to isolate an approach to drawing. So the glyphic is like very graphic, icons and things like that. And then there's a scale between the glyphic and what Dowd calls the Vudic. And the Vudic is a word that he's having to coin here, but the Vudic is the opposite of the graphic. It's like illusionistic artwork at its best. So like a trompe l'oeil painting or a highly realistic sculpture, but especially when we're talking about two-dimensional stuff, which is the majority of what Dowd's focused on, that would be called Vudic. So like Anthony Wachula's hyper realist painting would be Vudic, and a Charlie Brown drawing would be graphic. And then he comes up with some of the different things that we can think of, like there's a table of these poles. So the glyphic would be the calligraphic stroke, the glyph, it's direct, it's on something, it's fixed, and it persists. The Vudic is a dab, a dot, or a pixel. So you can also think about the difference between like a vector and raster. Like a vector tends to lean glyphic and raster tends to lean Vudic because it's a pixel, a dot, you're making a painting. The basis is the spritz. You have an indirect application. It's in something rather than on something. It's a variable position, and it's temporarily effervescent rather than persisting. So those are the two kinds of things that he's thinking about. That is really, really helpful for me because I need a vocabulary for those two things. Like, I've been trying to explain what I've learned about Sergio Topi, or what I've realized about Sergio Topi in other videos, and I didn't have the word Vudic, but I'm starting to realize now that what I want to describe about Topi is he's so good at hitting the midpoint of being perfectly graphic with everything he does, but also very Vudic in what he does. Dave McKean is someone else who I think is a cartoonist at heart, but he can paint with such like realistic Vudic applications that he gets then very graphic things that also look very realistic. So that's something that like then I want to do in my art is have this combination between the Vudic and the graphic. The next section here talks about hieratic thinking. The examples here of hieratic thinking are kind of a cartoon version of thinking, and this is very big in the way I teach drawing, as well as trying to make people aware that this is how they think about the world, and that's why they draw the way they do. But a hieratic representation of something matches your mental image of it. So like here, this car has been flattened out so we can see all the parts of it, but you could never obviously find a perspective which a car would look like this. So he's attaching those ideas to the glyphic, and like that's what I tell most of my students. Like, it's okay, like it's actually, cartoon brain is good, your hieratic brain is good. That's how you navigate the world. And I feel bad trying to teach people to draw beautifully, and this book is actually encouraging me to read, and that's kind of what I was coming to this book for, that I didn't get, is hoping that there would be more ideas on how to teach the practice of drawing as a human practice, and that wasn't in here so much. We get some good paintings here that go into the illusion of depth. These are a really good example of Vudic paintings. They have atmospheric perspective, full chiaroscuro, lighting, rendering, all of that stuff. He'll also separate out like Asian art as tending to be more graphic. I think one thing that he misses in the book is he misses the different types of graphic representation that you can get. I think Western tends to go more iconic, like Platonic ideals make you think that there's like one thing that is what it is to be a couch, and our society is very built on these things. And so like when people draw a couch, they draw the kind of iconic representation of couch, which is glyphic in the sense that Dowd means. But I think he ignores the idea that the Asian art tends to also be more essentialistic rather than iconic. and that in the graphic or in the glyphic you can break things up into iconic versus essentialistic, where like a Western artist might use this for bird, whereas the more like calligraphic drawing of a specific bird that you would get in like an Asian ink drawing, it's still very abstract. Sorry, that was a crappy bird I did as I was talking there, but it's still very abstract and very glyphic, but it's more referencing the specific animal. So that's something I think he misses in here. Just another interesting thought here. Drawing and printing have served epistemological ends. Printed pictures have carried news of the world all around. They have furthered the work of naturalists, engineers, scholars, and students. I really, really like that. Drawing-based practices, professions, and artifacts are worthy of greater study. There will be more of that later in the book, but for now we're looking over design. So just some more of that like really good argumentative weight for like the value of drawing as a way of thinking for our species and the culture. He expands here then from the glyphic and the vudic to the graphic and the painterly, that those can kind of be the same thing. And these are now more like modes of production, whereas the glyphic and the vudic are modes of thinking and seeing, the modes of producing graphic and painterly. So here you can think about in the graphic, you would have the glyphic and the symbolic design, vector-based art. It's binary, it's handmade, line art, spot colors, two colors, calligraphic strokes, glyphs, value, black and white are in the graphic. And then in the painterly, we have the vudic way of thinking. It's an image instead of a symbol. It's colored rather than designed is the primary. So line versus color basically is your primary way of thinking. Pixel-based rather than vector-based. Optical, machine-made. And then this is actually really interesting because this is what Sean and I talk about a lot, is that when it's talking about the plate making requirement for an image, that's how specific he gets. Line art, an actual analog line art, and then the painterly is halftone. So like playing with those kind of two different ways of image making, that's something we talk about a lot. And then process color versus spot color. The spot color is actually the color that is. Process color is illusionistic. So you can think about the graphic also being a little bit more what it is too. You know, it's a line on paper. So really interesting set of concepts throughout the book. I knew that this guy was like, I already knew when I got this book that I was stoked, but when I flipped through it and saw Rip Kirby, Alex Raymond Rip Kirby strip in here, I thought, well, Dowd really knows what he's talking about in terms of illustration and cartooning. Like he's not only picking Alex Raymond as one of the best, but he's picking his best work, the Rip Kirby, rather than the Flash Gordon, his mature work. And he's picking like one of the prime examples too. He's picking a really nice set of panels there. So really great taste in art throughout the book. You can see some of the other artists that he's got in here. It's this beautiful drawing by Austin Briggs, beautiful painting here by Cole Phillip. And then at this point he goes into like kind of some history of illustration and stuff as well, which is very, very cool. This is another thought that's really interesting. I'm just going to read this whole section right here. Glyphic achievement. To associate glyphic drawing with amateur status and the citizen is not to make a qualitative judgment. It's a cultural and political observation. Glyphic drawing is universally practiced. It does not require specialized equipment. The ensemble cast of draftspeople who routinely operate within this realm and the graphic translation of same includes designers, cartoonists, illustrators, graphic novelists, printmakers, calligraphers, hand letters, range from hobbyists to professionals. The best glyphic drawing can be breathtakingly lucid, elegant, preternaturally attuned to shifts in weight and density, delightfully inventive, strikingly dramatic, and above all, even when complex or dense, to say nothing of shaggy or frantic, coherent. In part because I think this approach to drawing has gone unnamed, operating on folk and trade levels all along. It has not been formally studied in art schools and departments. In my view, information and identity designers, classic comic artists, and contemporary hand letters do some of the best work in this realm. Such works tend to combine a quality of surprise with strong analytical sense. Consider duller, less coherent glyphic forms. The stuff abounds. And he goes on from there. But he's basically praising the glyphic as a way of thinking, as a way of representing, and the graphic as an understudied area of arts. I love that. And that whole argument there, it's like think about what you're overlooking when you're overlooking this. Same page, another really interesting thought. De-investment in manual capacity has had the opposite effect on the glyphic mode, rendering long-standing folk skills exotic and inaccessible. And that's something that's a problem in teaching that I worry about a lot. Is he's right. The majority of people do think and draw already really well in cartoons, and that's a more important type of communicative drawing, and that we do tend to, in education, push the Vudic and devalue the graphic. And actually the graphic seems to be the more human thing. The value publicly is for the awe and spectacle of the Vudic. They can't do it. They don't think that way. So like the public goes, oh wow, you painted so realistically. But they can all do cartoons. And that's a better way of thinking and talking. So I have to figure out in my teaching how to incorporate that more and not de-invest in not just the manual capacity of rendering realistically, there's that, but just the kind of manual communication through visuals seems really important. There's another really great argument for the value of learning to see. Formal discernment is gained through experience and peers into an expertise. All pursuits, vocational or avocational, reward the diligent acquisition of skill and cumulative judgment. Hostility to expertise is bogus populism, the stingy vogue of the bush leaguer, visible in malformed typography, reality television casting, know-nothing public officials, and charlatan scientists has refreshed our respect for hard-earned competence. I think that is a very potent statement of like the value of learning things, that our world today celebrates the devocation, especially with the AI, and it's sold as a good thing for the people, right? AI democratizes creativity, blah blah blah, and how many things have we seen now where it's like, well, the artists never deserved to make a living off that anyways, and blah blah. And I really like that he is a fierce proponent for learning and skill and competence. There's another argument here for the reason for learning to study drawing. The reason to study drawing is fundamentally resoundingly humane. It's the quickest route known to a confrontation with ignorance. Habits of casual assumption cannot survive an afternoon of drawing objects or plants on a table. The act of reporting from the physical world soon reveals how little we know and tests our ability to discern structure. For that reason alone, enforced modesty, it should inform the education of a citizen. And I think that's exactly right. It's a really strange experience when you start teaching to see people realizing how little they know about the world. Like there will be students who will have like, here's a thing like this book, and there's an apple in front of it, and the way my hand's in front of the book and your camera in the screen right now, and they'll draw it where like the hand's over here out of the way, and then all of the stuff is in the book because they just can't handle like the idea of overlap, or they'll just leave things out. They're so focused on drawing the pot, they'll just totally edit out the apple in front of it without even thinking about it. And I'll come by and be like, where's the apple at? And they'll, what apple? And then they'll look up and they realize that there's been an apple in front of them the whole time and they never saw it. It's startling what you can miss out based on what you think you should be seeing. And yeah, like if you want good critical thinkers, put them in a drawing class. Like that is the education is about critical thinking, and we play a really important role in that. Then in the kind of last third of the book, he then goes into, instead of ways of thinking or ways of producing, he goes into like careers and the types of images that are made, and splits into illustration and cartoon, realizing again that these vocabulary words mean a few different things, but he's using illustration to mean something that adds to a text. So like if this were to be going, this is illustration for an article in a magazine that's meant to illustrate an image within the magazine, whereas cartoons tend to stand on their own. They're not illustrating something else, they're expressing their own thing. But he's also saying that illustrations tend to be more painterly and they tend to be more vudic, whereas cartoons tend to be more glyphic and more graphic. Obviously, with illustration, you're entering an area where there's a wide range of styles. But this is another argument that I've made. Like, I had one of my mentors, one of my professors, and a great artist himself, Dr. Richard Saros. I put together a show of comic artwork for the community college I was working at the time, and he introduced me to someone and said, "Oh, this is Carson. He's a great cartoonist." And I said, I'm not a very good cartoonist." And he's like, "What are you talking about? Like, you draw comic books all the time." I said, "Yeah, but I'm pretty illustrative." And he didn't know what that meant. And so Dowd is making the argument, and he even goes into some statistics. Here are the statistics about like how much cartooning and illustration actually shows up in the fine arts. So this is using the calendar year of 2018 and choosing 10 significant art publishers, 10 reputed university art history departments, and 10 cultural institutions like museums and stuff like that. And they did a survey, and keep in mind, so they basically found out that like 2% of this information was about cartoonists. A few publishers issued comics and popular cultural titles as a separate series. Comics and cartooning enjoy a fairly robust publishing presence and some scholarship to match. Fantagraphics and Drawing Quarterly maintain ambitious publishing schedules. So obviously someone who knows our industry very well. Employing our loose standard, illustration and cartooning figured in slightly under 4% of the data, or fewer than 200 data points. Using the tighter standard, for which illustration or cartooning was in some small way addressed as a field, we tallied under 2%, fewer than 100 points out of 5,200 data points. So that illustration and cartooning is still very underrepresented in the fine arts. And then Dowd goes on to kind of argue that it shouldn't be. We should just be valued as our own field that's divorced from the fine arts. And I've said that many times, like, it's about venue. Like, you're not, I saw people reading a Robert Crumb comic on the wall in a gallery in New York, and it's like a 300-page book. Go buy the book at the front counter and like look at how the art was made. You're not supposed to read a comic on a wall. And like a lot of this art, this is art for illustrations. Or here we have the design that was made by Rick Yeager and built by Wilbur Rath for the Buck Roger cartoon strip. This was some models that were made for photo references. So this is an artistic production that has no commercial use. It was meant as reference material, but now is an important cultural artifact. Things like that don't necessarily belong in museums proper or comics and things like that. And so I really like that Dowd is making this argument for, even though it is an art form, keeping it out of the fine arts and keeping it as a different type of cultural production. And then that almost makes the argument that like this is where the real culture is happening, that the kind of hoity-toity highbrow stuff is like, well, no one's going to be talking about the banana on the wall 500 years from now, but they'll know who Mickey Mouse and Superman are, but like the majority of the fine artists are going to be, that we think are huge names today, are going to be totally forgotten and irrelevant to the canon. So the artists engaging in this type of cultural production are actually the more important ones, is I think what Dowd's arguing and what I would argue. We also get that Dowd himself is a practitioner. There's some examples here of his own illustrations. So this is being written by someone who actually really understands image making and what it does to you as a person. A lot of art theory and art history tends to be written by non-practitioners, and that's always a problem. And when you get a practitioner like David Dowd or James Elkins or a writer like that who is also a painter, they tend to be poo-pooed on. So it's a very strange thing within the art world. And then at the end here, he introduces some other categories here to the glyphic and Vudic, that the visual vocabulary of the glyphic is linear versus the Vudic is tonal. It's working in values, shapes, basically. Like this is a more Vudic for being tonal, but it's graphic for those tones being flat. So this is giving you an example. In illustration, a lot of good illustrators kind of hit that perfect balance between the glyphic and the Vudic. And I think, someone like Sergio Topi or Dave McKean or even Alex Raymond, that's what makes them so good, is their ability to be a cartoonist and an illustrator at the same time. And then spatial presentation, schematic versus volumetric, and then indicative versus descriptive. So the way he describes that, indicative versus descriptive, is like indicative is if someone's like running, we're running, and you have the little lines right here. That's an indicative that the character's running. Whereas if you have a cape flapping behind him, that would be descriptive. That's the example that Dowd gives. So a lot of really interesting concepts in here, a lot of really interesting like solidifying of vocabulary, and just giving it's a series of spectrums along which you can kind of organize stuff. Similar like Scott McCloud's Pyramid of Abstraction and Understanding Comics. I think this book just gives some very good basic way for understanding things, and a ton of amazing illustrations, things to go check on, other artists to follow up on. So really, really, for anyone who would be looking at this channel, I cannot recommend enough David B. Dowd's Stick Figures Drawing as a Human Practice. The Eisner nominated The Strange Death of Alex Raymond by Dave Sim and myself. This is a gorgeously illustrated and designed book, Dave doing most of the illustration, amazing compositions throughout. What Dave is doing is he's recording his obsession with the death of master cartoonist Alex Raymond behind the wheel of Stan Drake's car when they got into a car crash. The best description of the book that I've heard is that it's like understanding comics with pages like this, mixed with something like From Hell, when you get into the theories about what actually happened with the car crash. And then with Sean on production, it's just one of the most gorgeously printed books you could get a hold of.